All right. Thank you so much for having me back today. I am so excited to be here. I had such a blast last time I did part one. So I'm really looking forward to jumping into part two with you. Quick review on me if you weren't here last time. Hi, I'm Dr. Kate Rogers. I'm part of OCD Anxiety Centers. We have a few clinics across the valley. We offer intensive outpatient specifically for OCD and anxiety. I always say we're one-trick ponies. That's all we do all day, every day. So we get really passionate about it. I currently serve as our Director of Research and Outcomes. So I am the resident nerd. So I have been doing this for a really long time. I've been with this company for 9 years, and I get really overexcited sometimes when I teach about this topic. So as we talk about inhibitory learning today, I always feel like it is important to walk through some learning objectives as we go through. And my reasoning behind this is these are the most important things I want you to take away from this. This is what I want you to learn. Everything else is fluff. Everything else is fun. If you just walk away with these three things, I'm very happy. I do add fun and fluff sometimes because this is fun for me. As we jump in, I'm going to encourage all of you. It's always just painfully awkward to present to my own face. And so if you are willing, go ahead and turn on your cameras. I always prefer a more engaged presentation. I just get so tired of looking at myself and hearing myself. So anybody that's willing to share their face on camera, thank you so much. You're wonderful. Our learning objectives today are, I want you to be able to confidently define what is inhibitory learning and explain how new learning can inhibit old learning in the context of exposure and response prevention therapy. I also want you to be able to talk a little bit, at least, about how this theory of inhibitory learning compares to our more traditional theory of emotional processing. I also, and this one is probably the most important one, I want to make sure that everyone walks away from this recognizing the importance of providing client-centered care and having nice flexibility when utilizing inhibitory learning. It's kind of the underpinnings for exposure therapy. At the end of the day, you always have to meet your client where they're at and do what is right for them. And sometimes that requires some flexibility in using these principles. So this is what's most important to learn today. As we go through the presentation, if you have questions that come up, please write them down. They're probably amazing questions. I'm always really blown away by the questions people ask. Write them down and we will walk through them together. We'll have at least 10 minutes at the end where you'll have an opportunity to ask those questions. If you have a burning question that doesn't get answered, my email address is on the last slide here. Please don't panic. I'm always happy to talk to you afterwards, answer emails, whatever's most helpful. One of the things we do as an organization is we try our best to be a resource to the community. And so please use that resource. All right, who's excited? I'm obviously excited and slightly caffeinated, so. Quick review. In part one, we did a nice overview of the basics of what is inhibitory learning. So the basics here is that inhibitory learning is just a process of creating new learning on top of old learning and making the new learning bigger, stronger, louder in order to inhibit the old learning. And so in the context of anxiety, OCD, we can see that our old learning is something like, here's a trigger. When we see that trigger, we perceive a threat. New learning that we want to be bigger, louder, stronger through exposure therapy is that that same trigger elicits the perceived safety instead of a perceived threat. We need that new learning to be bigger, louder, stronger than the old learning, because then the new learning inhibits the old learning, and the new learning runs the show. We talked about this in relation to OCD and anxiety. Specifically, we walked through how at the core of OCD and anxiety is this idea of a false alarm. Our anxiety alarm starts to go off when it doesn't need to. When we are in fact safe, our brain says, "You are in danger, do something." And we briefly walked through what we mean by some critical terms. What is exposure and what is response prevention? Exposure is intentionally placing yourself into a situation where you may be vulnerable to a perceived threat. We're going to walk right up to this trigger on purpose. Response prevention is remaining vulnerable to that perceived threat by resisting the urge to engage in neutralizing behaviors. Remember, neutralizing behaviors are any behaviors that try to neutralize the perceived threat. These behaviors try to neutralize this. We're not going to engage in them. We're going to resist and allow ourselves to learn something new. These are the critical elements that work together at the absolute core of exposure therapy to recalibrate that false alarm so that it functions as a nice, healthy anxiety alarm again. We dove into the specifics of how inhibitory learning works within this process, right? Exposure and response prevention has been around for quite some time and been really embraced by a lot of people. Inhibitory learning targets these particular parts of our cycle. It targets the connection between neutralizing behaviors and, when we do them, what we learn. We learn every single time we engage in a neutralizing behavior, we learn the threat is real, and we strengthen the connection between the trigger and the perception of threat. And it gets bigger, bigger, bigger every time we do a neutralizing behavior. And what we need is new learning that's even bigger than that old learning to break the cycle. You were introduced to pigeony, as my son lovingly has named the pigeon in my metaphor. We talked about how at the core of our anxiety system, it's really quite simple and almost binary. We learn about safety, we learn about danger. Every time we learn about safety, pigeony puts a card in the safety deck. Every time we learn about danger, pigeony puts a card in the danger pile. Tall pile wins and will inhibit the other learning. The tall pile will run the show. And so our job is to figure out how we can get pigeony to put more cards in the safety pile so it is bigger, louder, stronger than the cards in the danger pile. Today, we're going to dive into the details of how we use principles of inhibitory learning to do that, to get a taller safety pile than the danger pile. We talked about why it is so important, right? Why don't we just do exposure therapy? It is what it is. It works really well. Because the blunt reality is this was never a fair fight. It takes on average a person with OCD 7 to 14 years to get an appropriate diagnosis and effective treatment. And diagnostically, someone with OCD spends at least an hour a day on obsessions and compulsions every day. So we have a very tall danger pile. It's just not a fair fight. And because of that, we want to think about how do we get the best bang for our buck? How do we get, I said we do an intensive outpatient program. That's one of the ways that we game the system a little bit. We want a higher dosage of exposures because that's how we increase the safety pile. But in addition to that, there are ways to use principles of inhibitory learning to really maximize the learning you get from each exposure that allows that safety pile to build more quickly so that we have a more fair fight. So we're going to walk through these one by one. Here's kind of an overview of how do we take those principles of inhibitory learning to help us maximize the learning from exposure and response prevention. Interventions that increase the likelihood that the new learning will inhibit the old learning. That's what we're really shooting for. And we want to think about what's going to do this in the long run, right? We know that these are chronic conditions that we're treating, OCD, anxiety disorders. These are chronic, so we really want to think long game. And principles of inhibitory learning can really help us do that. So number one, maximum violation of threat expectancies. Let's dive into what that is, and we're going to dive into each one of these. Maximum violation of threat expectancies is a really fancy way of saying our brains learn best when they are surprised. Meaning the wider the gap between what the client expects and what they actually experience, more distance between those two things, the better the learning will be. This is one of the most important principles of inhibitory learning. And there's a few reasons why. You see, I put a little asterisk on there. That's for my own brain. This was the thing that really made me hesitate to really embrace the principles of inhibitory learning when I first learned about this. Because all the way back to probably introduction to psychology class, in the textbook, we all learn about this idea called the Yerkes-Dodson law. Does any, show of hands, who's familiar with the Yerkes-Dodson law? This is the idea that there's an optimal level of anxiety and arousal that matches peak performance. So if you're not anxious at all, you're kind of going to phone it in. If you're anxious enough, your performance is going to be fabulous. And if you're too anxious, your performance starts to tank. And it's this lovely little graph that everybody's seen in a textbook called the Yerkes-Dodson law. And it's so impactful in the field of psychology. We don't have a lot of laws in the field of psychology. We have theories, we have concepts, we have ideas. This one is called the Yerkes-Dodson law. There's something really intense about that. And so people get really caught up in it, and I know that I did. The problem is, what happens is that people get mixed up. I got mixed up. People start to think that this Yerkes-Dodson law is talking about learning, meaning you learn the best at peak anxiety. But that's not what it is. It's not talking about learning. It is talking about performance. And those are critically different things. There's a peak level of anxiety, at least for mice, which was what this study actually was for the Yerkes-Dodson law. There's a peak level of, or an optimal level of anxiety that yields peak performance from mice. It is at no point saying that there's an optimal level of anxiety for peak learning. We often get that mixed up. This also gets kind of blurred together with the idea of a window of tolerance. Again, not learning. What we know about learning, which is the basis for exposure therapy. What we know about learning is that our brains learn best when they are surprised. And so inhibitory learning really capitalizes on that idea to try to maximize the violation of threat expectancies. Meaning, I expect this dangerous, horrible thing to happen. It doesn't. That is a violation of threat expectancy. It's oh, weird, that horrible thing didn't happen, wild. The more surprised someone is that something horrible didn't happen, the stronger the learning. So if you think about this, For every exposure you do, if you can maximize the gap between what the client expects and what actually happens, you get stronger learning every time. That is really going to help in this very unfair fight against a super tall danger pile. Now, how do we actually put this into practice? It's a great idea, right? But let me give you some how-tos. The first thing you want to do when capitalizing on this maximum violation of threat expectancies is when you design exposures. And you want to help teach your clients that when they design exposures, because they should be able to design their own exposures as well, that they also are thoughtful about this. When designing exposure, you want to be thoughtful and intentional about setting up a situation that is likely to lead to surprise learning. You want to create exposure parameters based on the client's expectation of aversive outcomes. This is critically important and where most people struggle. Most people say, "What are you afraid of?" And then they just come up with like these random exposures that are somewhat tied to that topic. You'll hit sometimes and you'll get something out of it, but it will never be as impactful as if you take the time to understand, what does the client think is going to happen in this scenario? Do they think some sort of catastrophe is going to happen? Do they think they will not be able to tolerate their emotional experience? Do they think they'll crack and do the neutralizing behavior? How long do they think it will take before those outcomes happen? Really want to take your time and collect that information from the client and teach them how to slow down and do that. Because then you can help set up an exposure that is most likely to yield that surprise learning, the most powerful learning. In addition, and this is where I usually lose people because they're like, "Nah, girl." In addition, it is really valuable to, rather than using the classic exposure hierarchy, we gradually move up to more and more challenging exposures. Instead of that, it's really valuable to randomly select which exposure you're going to practice from a list of exposures, all of which have been cleverly designed to maximize the violation of threat expectancy. Now, once you do all that, you actually have to do the exposures, right? The client has to do the exposures. And when they do, it is incredibly helpful to make sure to highlight that violation of threat expectancy. So when the client notices, or even the clinician notices, an expectancy violation, we want to shine the brightest possible light on that. I like to do this in probably the most obnoxious of ways. Find out what is the client afraid is going to happen. And then at a certain strategic point during the exposure, I say, so has that thing happened yet? And I try to say it like really neutral. And then when they tell me, no, it hasn't, I go, what? That is so weird. What do you make of that? Very annoying. And the teenagers roll their eyes and go, blah, 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 blah. Here's what I learned. But it's a very important part of this process because we want to capitalize on the maximum violation of threat expectancies. So you really want to shine a light when it happens. Did the terrible thing happen? Oh, it didn't? Neat. Let's pay attention to that. You're creating more and more of these beautiful neural connections every time you do that. You're making it more likely for that new learning to be absorbed and stick around long term. Remember, we are playing the long game. And then in a really similar vein, you want to take a moment at the end of the exposure to reflect on what was learned. We do intensive outpatient. Our clients are with us 3 hours a day, 5 days a week. It is way too easy for someone in that situation to start phoning it in and just going through the motions. It's really fatiguing, it's scary and challenging. And so we want to make sure that we slow it down and say, okay, you just did this exposure. Before you just rush into the next exposure, take a moment. What did you learn? The clients that can say, here is what I learned, here's what surprised me the most, those clients are getting bigger, louder, stronger new learning. And they're going to get that taller safety pile much faster than someone that's just going through the motions. So these are my tips for how do we get this maximum violation of threat expectancies that's really going to help us inhibit that old learning. Next, this one's really important. We touched on it briefly in part 1. The next intervention that increases the likelihood that the new learning will inhibit the old learning is getting rid of the neutralizing behaviors. Remember, our brains learn through our behavior. And every single time we do a neutralizing behavior, any behavior that tries to neutralize the perceived threat, that behavior strengthens the old learning. If we remember Pigeony here, remember when we do an exposure, he's going to drop that card in the safety pile. Yay, new learning. And when we do a neutralizing behavior, which is a really natural reaction to an exposure, he's going to take another card, he's going to drop it into the danger pile, and it's a wash. We are not gaining any ground here. Doing that exposure didn't get you much because you also did the neutralizing behavior. This is why response prevention, resisting the neutralizing behaviors, is so, so critically important to that inhibitory learning process. Next intervention that increases the likelihood new learning will inhibit the old learning is varying contexts. Our clients hear me harp on this all the time because this is the essence of homework. Like I said, our clients are with us 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, and I'm still asking them to do homework in between those sessions. Like, I'm just the worst. But it's so important. There's a reason why we push for this. It's because when a client learns something in multiple contexts, meaning different places with different people at different times, that learning is more likely to generalize. And if you've ever done anything with learning, you know how critically important generalization is. Now, here is the thing. When we learn about danger, that learning tends to naturally generalize like wildfire. And for good reason, right? That's how our species stays alive. We want that learning to generalize very, very quickly because it protects us. The problem is learning about safety does not naturally and automatically generalize in the same way. It does not spread like wildfire because why would it need to protect the species? Learning about danger automatically spreads. Learning about safety doesn't, so we have to do it manually. And that's where varying context comes into play. If we intentionally practice the same exposures across lots of different contexts, we're manually spreading it. And that's how we compete with that old learning and how easily it generalizes. I always say we need to fight fire with fire. And it has to be really, really frequent, really, really intentional. Next intervention that increases the likelihood that the new learning will inhibit the old learning is layering of multiple fear cues. This is an easy trap that people fall into, so let's break it down together. What does this mean? So you may recall in our original diagram, we had a trigger that leads to a perceived threat, right? But what if we have multiple triggers? When we do an exposure, we're saying, okay, here's the trigger. Let's go to it intentionally. When we layer multiple fear cues, we're adding more triggers. Saying not only am I going to expose myself to this trigger, but I'm going to expose myself to 2 triggers at once, 3 triggers at once, 4 triggers at once, whatever. It is important because I've seen this go wrong. Initially, when someone's starting exposure therapy, please try your best to design exposures with 1 trigger at a time. 1 trigger, meaning the client is intentionally going to enter a situation where 1 trigger is present. Can't always control that. Do your best. After exposures are initially designed with 1 trigger, the learning process can further be strengthened by designing exposures with multiple triggers that are present at the same time. So what this looks like is we're going to do an exposure to 1 trigger until we're not really surprised by the outcome anymore. Remember, we learn best when we are surprised. Well, we're not really all that surprised by the outcome anymore. Let's start adding triggers. Because what that essentially does is it maximizes the violation of threat expectancy. We get that gap once again between what we think is going to happen and what actually happens. Someone that has really mastered an exposure is going to be like, oh yeah, like that trigger, I don't even think that bear is going to eat my face anymore. And then if you can pair it with another trigger, all of a sudden it's like, ooh, the odds aren't in my favor anymore, and I think something horrible is going to happen. You get to kind of reset and get bigger learning again. This is such a helpful tool to really game the exposure system and get the most learning, the most bang for your buck. But make sure that you start with 1 trigger as best you can. Don't get overexcited and jump to 4 triggers at once. Not only is it, less likely your client's going to be willing to do it, but more importantly, you've wasted some of that potential surprise learning. You started with too many triggers. This is one of my both favorite and least favorite elements of inhibitory learning. This again is something that increases the likelihood that the new learning will inhibit the old learning. Occasional aversive outcomes. Let's be real with ourselves, yes. Sometimes bad things do happen. You are not a genie. You are not able to say, I, as the magical therapist that I am, know that you think this bad thing is going to happen and I know it won't. No, you don't. Don't lie to yourselves. None of us do. We simply can't know for sure. And the blunt reality of the world we live in is that bad things do happen. Now, what I love about the inhibitory learning perspective is that through this lens, there is value in those sorts of mishaps. If you're an exposure therapist for long enough, you have a story or quite a few stories of an exposure gone wrong. What you do with the potential learning in that moment, what you do with that opportunity makes a big difference. Now, keep in mind that if clients learn best when the element of surprise is present, like we've been talking about, then maintaining the element of surprise is likely to enhance long-term learning, right? This is the essence of life. We're going to be surprised. The unexpected is going to happen sometimes, not most of the time, but sometimes. So we want to be prepared for that and capitalize on that learning through surprise. One way to maintain the element of surprise is to occasionally experience an aversive outcome, right? It's kind of like a variable reinforcement schedule. Like it's not the same every single time, but it's safe enough. I always like to share a story to really elicit this. Like I said, every good exposure therapist has a story. Funny enough, this actually is not my story. It's a supervisor of mine back in Washington, D.C., where I got my own training. And the story is about a little 11-year-old boy. And this is a story from like the 90s. So you have to keep that in mind. This little boy was terrified of bugs. He was so terrified of bugs that he couldn't even leave his house. And this is the 90s. That's sad. There's no tablet, there's no cell phone, there's no streaming services. Like that is sad. He can't even leave his house and go outside. Now, luckily, he found a good exposure therapist, worked really hard through exposure therapy, and worked his way all the way up to this amazing moment of victory where he is, you got to kind of picture this scenario. He's standing in the parking lot of this clinic. It's like a little brick building, Silver Spring, Maryland. If you're familiar with the area, you can really picture it. He's standing in the parking lot in front of this little garden strip. I worked there for 5 years, and there's not really anything that grows in the garden strip. There's like a little sapling tree that with the little holes that hold it up. I don't think it ever grew, but it was like mulch, dirt in this little garden strip. A little boy standing next to his therapist name is Dave. And he's so proud of himself because he is holding in his bare hands a caterpillar. If you've ever been to Maryland, it's lousy with caterpillars. It's actually pretty gross. It's like sacks of them. I'm traumatized for life. That's where I grew up. There is a caterpillar in this child's hand. The kid that was so afraid of bugs that he could not even leave his house. And he's so proud of himself. And Dave, the therapist, is so proud of him. And Dave is a crier, so like tears are starting to roll down because this kid is taking his life back. But remember, this is a story about bad things happening. So, as this killer boy is holding Caterpillar in his hands, something bad happens. And this is a true story. The caterpillar explodes. This is true. Not in like fire and brimstone, but like guts. Like the caterpillar explodes. Now there is no caterpillar, but the little boy is covered in caterpillar guts. Something bad has happened. True thing. Feel free to Google. You can't unlearn this though. This is a real thing about some caterpillars in Maryland. Super gross. Caterpillar has exploded. Now, in this moment, this is an aversive outcome. This is an interesting window. What we know about learning and memory is that there's this interesting window of time right after something bad happens, not during, right after something bad happens, where the hippocampus really lights up. And if you have any memory of, that's funny pun, any memory of what the hippocampus does, it is in charge of taking short-term memory and translating it into long-term memory, the memory we keep. So right after something bad happens, hippocampus lights up, and it's like this kind of supercharged window of learning because what you learn is most likely to go into long-term memory. Learning is useless without memory, right? They work together. So when there's an aversive outcome, you have a little window of time right after that, where the next behavior you engage in is worth a lot of learning. It's a great cheat code to fight against that really tall pile of danger and get a nice chunk of safety learning. So Does anybody have an idea? What could this little boy do? Standing there in front of the little garden strip, covered in caterpillar guts, what can he do next to capitalize on new learning? What ideas do y'all have? I'll just stare at you forever. Somebody's got to be brave. Somebody says laugh. What else? What should this little boy do? Somebody just said it. Oh, that was also cute. Somebody said something about a caterpillar funeral, which is not super helpful, but adorable. I saw somebody say, pick up another caterpillar. Now I'm watching these amazing clinicians in front of me come up with just the sweetest, most creative answers to this question, right? Get curious, laugh, do a ritualistic funeral for the caterpillar. Like, these are lovely therapeutic sorts of things. When it comes to exposure therapy, you gotta keep it simple. That's the beauty of it, really. All this little boy needs to do to absolutely capitalize on this aversive outcome is pick up another caterpillar. Because think about it. Think about that gap between what I think is going to happen and what actually happens. What are the actual odds that the second caterpillar explodes? It's really low. It is possible, but it is really low. But this child's brain, covered in caterpillar guts, is screaming, every caterpillar will explode forever. He's very, very sure. Feels pretty confident about that. And so if we can get him to pick up another caterpillar and that one doesn't explode, we have a massive gap between what they think is going to happen and what actually happens. And it's right after something bad happens with this supercharged window of learning where the hippocampus is lit up. We want the kid to pick up another caterpillar. We teach this to our clients, and it's really cute, actually. I had someone, I was on a call this morning where they referenced this really hard time in their life. It was a former client of ours. And they said, man, that was an exploding caterpillar for me. Here's what I learned from it. And I was like, oh, my heart, that's so beautiful. This idea of an exploding caterpillar, and the next thing you do is you pick up another caterpillar, is so powerful. And because the blunt reality is bad things happen in the world we live in, it is really helpful that through this inhibitory learning lens, we can make the most out of those moments. Do not waste them, and don't pretend they won't happen. They will. Hey, one more. All of this is beautiful, right? But like I said, learning is pretty useless without memory. We are playing the long game here. So you want to be really thoughtful about how we capitalize on memory and strengthen it, how we get something from short-term memory into long-term memory. One of the ways to do this through an inhibitory learning lens is to use retrieval cues. Because inhibitory learning is really only helpful if the client remembers the new learning enough to inhibit the old learning. The retrieval cues are used to remind the client of what they learned during the therapy, during those exposures. Now, an example, this is the one that we use most often by default, is when a client completes our program, they get like a cute little bag, really recognizing their achievement and everything they've learned. They get to reflect on that with their group, but they also get something tangible. You probably can't see it through the screen. This is our old version. The bracelet says, live uncertain, and a little picture of our logo. And it's so cool to watch them put on this bracelet and really solidify that learning. And then they have something tangible, visual that they can refer back to that instantly reminds them of that new learning, that instantly brings it right back to the surface. It's so helpful. You really want to customize this to each of your clients. All of our clients get one of these, but we also have clients that need something more customized. I've had clients that had like a special golf ball that represented this for them. I've had clients that do like a little doodle of the exploding caterpillar on their relapse prevention plan. That is their retrieval cue. So you want to make sure that this is nice and customized to the client, visual, tangible, accessible. A bracelet is great because they wear it every day. It's really subtle, but it means something to them. These retrieval cues are so helpful, and caution, it is important to not introduce the retrieval cues too early in the treatment process. You want to be really thoughtful and strategic about timing, because the idea of these is that they are supposed to pair to the learning that's already happened. And you don't want to accidentally decrease the gap between what they expect and what actually happens. You want to maintain that element of surprise as much as possible. So we typically don't introduce these until like the last week of a client's programming. And it's a really helpful tool, especially when we are playing the long game like we talked about. A couple of quick notes. I mentioned at the beginning, I want you to be able to talk a little bit about what is the difference between inhibitory learning and emotional processing theory. Emotional processing theory is kind of the original theory behind exposure and response prevention. It's Edna Foa's theory. She applied it to both OCD and PTSD, and it has reigned supreme for many, many years and been truly valuable to the field. The emotional processing theory essentially emphasizes the gradual reduction of fear through repeated exposure and habituation, the natural reduction of fear over time when exposed to a trigger. Now, the idea here is that you're basically like wearing down that emotional response to the trigger until it doesn't evoke anxiety anymore. That's the essence of emotional processing theory. There's nothing especially wrong with it. It's a great theory. Inhibitory learning theory actually goes all the way back to Pavlov and has kind of been revived through this new lens of exposure therapy. Inhibitory learning focuses on actively learning new, non-threatening associations to counteract the existing fear responses. So there's like sanding down the old one through gradual fear reduction versus inhibitory learning, which is taking the new learning, putting it on top of the old learning to inhibit the old learning. These two don't necessarily clash, but they're a little different. And it's really helpful to understand those differences. Where this comes up most often and where clinicians get really stuck is, why are we using a randomized exposure list instead of a hierarchy? If you've done exposure therapy in the past through the emotional processing theory lens, you have used an exposure hierarchy. I spent most of my career using an exposure hierarchy and really believing in its value. I still believe in its value in many cases. However, I strongly believe that the best default is an exposure list. Only use a hierarchy when you absolutely need to meet the client where they're at and give client-centered care. But start with the assumption that this client is an absolute warrior. They can do more than you think they can. They can do more than they think they can. Start them with a randomized exposure list. The differences here, a hierarchy sets up a gradual progression of exposures rated by predicted difficulty And the very first thing that this does is it limits the potential for expectancy violation. They've already predicted exactly what's going to happen, and they're starting with the tiniest one. And so they're less likely to be surprised right out of the gate. And so we're losing some of that power. It's still great exposure work, and it's 1,000 times better than nothing. But if we're really trying to game the system and get the best bang for your buck, hierarchy is not going to get you there as quickly as an exposure list. The other thing that's really important here, and I hear this all the time, the idea of a hierarchy sends a very consistent message to clients and therapists that flooding is dangerous. Flooding is this rush of anxiety, on that Yerkes Dotson, it's like way over here where you're just a puddle on the floor. A hierarchy says you can't handle that, but that's not true. When we use our subjective units of distress scale, the SUDS, we go 0 to 10, 0 is no anxiety, a 10 is the most anxiety you could ever experience. And the traditional idea was you don't want them to be at a 10. A 10 is flooding. But in reality, a 10 ain't gonna hurt you. It doesn't feel good, but it is safe. And it is actually quite valuable for clients to learn that a 10 out of 10 on the SUDS is perfectly safe. And so an exposure list supports that much better than a hierarchy does. The other issues with hierarchies is the steps of a hierarchy can really become very artificial as you're just trying to fill in the gaps between kind of the steps. In an attempt to get that nice gradual progression. And that just doesn't mimic real life very well. Real life certainly doesn't work in a nice gradual way. It just kind of gets thrown at you more like confetti. A hierarchy is also completely dependent upon habituation, a gradual reduction in fear over time. One of the biggest reasons we moved away from emotional processing theory and towards inhibitory learning is that there are subsets of the OCD and anxiety population that don't experience habituation. Plenty of research, for example, has shown that disgust does not habituate at nearly the same rate as fear. Fear, most typically, habituates somewhat linearly. Disgust is more like this. And so you've got a whole subset of our population that is not being served by this, that feels like they are failing and feels stuck because they can't progress to the next rung on their hierarchy. And so they're not getting the same exposure reps and experiences. And we know better as a field at this point. There's plenty of research to show us this. So an exposure list creates a more effective option for a broader range of people. Now, exposure lists, more like real life, set up for maximum surprise, sends a really consistent message. You can do this. A 10 will not hurt you. And it keeps people from getting stuck. There's never a failure. There's always learning. Remember the pigeony has the little baggie of meth because we are always learning. And an exposure list really supports that nicely. Why does theory matter at all? I started by saying I'm a big giant nerd, so this is something that does matter though. You should not be doing exposure therapy without a solid understanding of what you are doing and why. You can't just do it surface level. You have to understand the theory behind it because it allows you to kind of manipulate the parameters of those exposure to set your client up for success and get the most out of the therapy. We are not just here to torment people. We are here to help them learn. And so you shouldn't do exposure therapy if you don't have an understanding of the theory behind it. And a really strong conceptual understanding helps you much more appropriately flex. You want to be able to be flexible based on the client in front of you and their needs. Which of these approaches are we going to use? For our clinics, blanket default, we use inhibitory learning, and all of our clinicians are also trained in emotional processing theory so that they can pivot when a client needs that. Everybody is able to use a hierarchy when their clients need that. I would rather them do that than nothing. And so it's really important to understand both so that you can flex appropriately. And now I've vomited at you so many things today. What questions do we have?
We did have a couple questions come in, Kate, earlier. For example, Rebecca had asked the question, what is a neutralizing behavior? Can you kind of give us an example briefly of what that would be?
Absolutely. It's such an important question. A neutralizing behavior is any behavior that tries to neutralize a perceived threat. This is not a good or bad thing. It simply is any behavior that tries to neutralize a perceived threat. If a grizzly bear is in front of you and you run for it, running is a neutralizing behavior. If a teddy bear is in front of you and your brain says that's dangerous and you run for it, running is the neutralizing behavior. In one scenario, it was really reasonable. In the other scenario, it really wasn't. That is not what matters here. A neutralizing behavior, simply some behavior that tries to neutralize a perceived threat. We always learn when we engage in a neutralizing behavior that the threat was real, and we learn that really strongly. Does that answer the question? I could go down quite the rabbit hole with that.
I think that's great. Deanne had also asked if the client is anxious and does deep breathing or mindfulness, calls others, listens to music, goes on a jog, engages in a hobby, so like going through a coping list, do those coping behaviors get to be neutralizing behaviors?
Oh my gosh, I love this question so much. Look, I'm like bouncing in my chair. I'm so excited. Sometimes, yes. What we teach our own team and clients is to always ask the golden question: what is the function of that behavior? What are you trying to accomplish with that behavior? If the function is to neutralize a perceived threat, stop it. It's a neutralizing behavior. If the function is, well, both, it's to neutralize, but it's also to do this other thing, stop it. It's a neutralizing behavior. Deep breathing is my favorite example of this. I am hypnosis trained. I have loved the idea of deep breathing my whole life. And when I became an OCD anxiety specialist, it really clashed with what we were doing. And I had to really dive down a rabbit hole on this. And ultimately, what I decided was, you don't need it. And typically, someone is using deep breathing because they are afraid of their own emotional reaction. They are afraid of anxiety. They see anxiety itself as a threat. This really becomes clear when you work with a lot of panic disorder. That deep breathing is absolutely a neutralizing behavior. Can it also have lots of wonderful benefits? Of course. And it's a neutralizing behavior. It's just a stupid pigeon running this show, y'all. So it's going in the danger pile. And when I have taken it away from clients, like, let's try the exposure without it. Just toss it in the trash. I'll tell you, nothing bad happens. You really don't lose anything. And so I really encourage you, take a leap of faith with this one. Dump that deep breathing in the trash if the function of it is to try to chase away anxiety, control your emotions because you're afraid of them, because your brain says they're dangerous. We want our clients to learn that they can tolerate their emotions, they can ride that wave, they can survive it. A 10 out of 10 is perfectly safe. If deep breathing keeps them from learning that, it's not helping.
Great. And then Deanne also asked an interesting question here. And this is kind of back when we were referring to the exploding caterpillar, but how can this be utilized with triggers in PTSD? And then she also asked, how could this be used with, say, scrupulosity and with unwanted obsessive thoughts in response to external cues?
Oh, such excellent questions. Okay, those are a lot of different questions though. So I'm going to start with PTSD. I'm actually super passionate about this one. How do we use this with PTSD? Great treatment for PTSD. In fact, all of the best treatment for PTSD has been found that the mechanism of action at the core is exposure. Even EMDR with the darty eyes and the blinky lights has been found to be so effective. And the mechanism of action has been found to be exposure at the core. It's exposure with a beautiful bow that's more digestible for people. That's what makes it so helpful. So exposure through an inhibitory learning lens with PTSD looks like in vivo exposures. These are exposures to external triggers that are safe. Remember, set your clients up for success. Do not send them back into a dangerous situation. Someone with trauma, their anxiety alarm went off because they were in danger. It is still going off when they are safe. Don't send them back into real danger. Think, what are they going to learn from this? We do in vivo exposures to safe external triggers. We also recognize in PTSD that oftentimes there are these intrusive memories that the brain is saying are dangerous. Clients spend a lot of energy trying to avoid these memories. They use substances, they won't go to sleep, they distract themselves, they numb out because they are trying to avoid the memories. So we also do exposures to the trauma memories themselves to learn that the memory itself cannot hurt you, even though the event did. Scrupulosity is tricky in a completely different way, because you have to narrow down the threat expectancy, right? We want to get maximum violation of threat expectancy. And on the surface, someone with scrupulosity will often say, what are you afraid of? I'm afraid I'm going to go to hell forever. I can't test that. I can't be like, okay, we did this thing. Did you go to hell forever? I just can't. And so we have to really whittle it down to what do you think is going to happen here and now? So we really want to be thoughtful about those exposure parameters to make the exposure therapy very effective. Like, if I break this rule, what happens right now? So we can still get them those reps of new learning with truly out being able to test if they're going to hell for all eternity. Oftentimes this looks like a focus on uncertainty and being able to tolerate that they just don't get to know. They just can't. And being able to tolerate that is often the most effective exposure. And I forget the third part of that question.
I think it was on the same lines, just as it applied to, for example, obsessive thoughts in response to external cues.
Yeah, okay. So this is a great one. This comes up often. Um, the idea, you might have heard of this idea of pure O. I hate that term, to be perfectly honest. I think it's silly and misleading because the idea behind pure O is that these are obsession only cases, and they're not. What they actually mean is that there aren't any like overt behavioral compulsions. They're mental compulsions, but they are mental neutralizing behaviors. And so what we do is we really thoughtfully design exposures to recognize what are those mental neutralizers trying to accomplish, what is the function of the mental behavior, and then we come up with the exposure to lean into the opposite. Often this looks like someone really radically accepting, I can't know for sure. And if you can really lean in to this idea of, I can't know for sure, you really don't need to keep going through that mental review. You know you're not going to get what you're looking for. And so that's kind of what exposures can look like on the mental side of things.
Great. And Brooke asked, is emotional processing theory also related to EMDR?
I think there is some overlap there. In fact, there's some component, like I said, the mechanism of action has been found to be exposure at the core. And so EMDR, at least in my understanding, is kind of a combination of emotional processing theory and the eye movement desensitization and reprocessing theory. Great question.
Someone else asked, working in a school setting, how can we support inhibitory learning skills when we work with children at such small rates and timeframes?
Oh, that's such a great question. Honestly, kids really thrive when you can turn something into play and hand them a little gem. I remember I went maybe a year ago to my son's school. I think he was in kindergarten, maybe in preschool, and it was like career day. And so we have, people with these really normal careers going in and talking about what they do. And I was like, what am I going to do with these like 5-year-olds right now? So I go in and I said, I am a fear doctor. And we came up with these little games that were all about facing your fears. And so I just taught them, what do you do when you're scared? You face your fears. And we played these little games all about this. And I've actually done this with my son for many years, but in a really short time frame, which is typically all you have with elementary aged kiddos in a school setting. If they can only grab that from you, what do we do when we're scared? We face our fears. That will get them really, really far. It's probably the best little gem that you can give them in that short amount of time.
Great. Another question. Kimberly asked, do you think that these techniques also connect with attachment disordered behavior?
Boy, I mean, the ideas of attachment theory are so kind of in everything. It's connected to everything we do, how we learn things, how we see things, how we experience things. And so I think there's always going to be an overlap. I think as clinicians, the more we can learn about various theories, a nice integrative approach and have a home base of full understanding of a couple, we'll be able to meet our clients' needs better and better. I use a really pretty strict treatment protocol in therapy, but I'm able to navigate through it with a lot of these other theories in mind. And I think attachment theory is one of those that is like, if you don't know much about it, take some time and Google because it's always going to help you because it's always going to be a part of somebody's life and the map of their brain that's gotten them to where they are. Great question.
Amanda asked, where do you suggest a clinical social worker get additional training about topics covered today?
Beautiful question. You really handed me that on a silver platter. If you would like some additional training on this, there's a couple of resources I recommend. I recommend the International OCD Foundation. You can go to iocdf.org. They have a tremendous amount of resources. They're really well vetted, reliable, very scientifically based. They offer free webinars. They have an annual conference. This year will be in Chicago. I get most of my CEUs there every year. And it's just a really fabulous organization that has a lot of resources for continued learning. We at OCD Anxiety Centers more locally are also always happy to be a resource for the community. And sometimes what that looks like is reach out. We've got our email and website right here. Let me know if you're interested in some additional training for your team. We have a whole outreach team that really thrives on this and provides this service to the community. If you are someone who wants to take some of our aftercare clients, clients that have already gone through our intensive program and need a community provider for continued outpatient, we also offer some extra training for those providers to help set them up for success in supporting those aftercare clients. So always reach out and we're happy to be that resource.
Awesome. Yeah, and I see a few have already entered their emails into the chat. So I'm going to make sure you and Josh get those so
Thank
that
you.
anyone interested can observe a group or even if you just have questions. Definitely. And Deanne asked also, what do you do during the period of exposure when you're not doing the neutralizing behavior?
That's a good question. People often really want to like fill that space. It's a really easy trap to fall into. And then you just end up doing like new, weirder, clever exposure or clever neutralizers. My answer is nothing, like whatever you would typically be doing. One of the biggest pitfalls I see with exposure therapists is when they tell the client, just sit with it. And I watched the client literally sit down and stare at the wall. And I'm like, no, 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 that's not what that means. It doesn't mean physically sit down with your emotion. It means allow it to be there, fully experience it as you continue on your day with whatever you would normally be doing. If that's completing a task, um, having a conversation. That's what sit with it really means. So you don't need to fill that space with anything in particular. It's just your normal life. It always makes me think of those cute kids' books, Amelia Bedelia. I don't know if y'all are familiar with those, but it's like she hears something and she'll do that like very exact literal thing. And that's the essence of the entire book series. And every time I watch a client and they're just sitting there staring, I'm like, what are you doing, man? They're like, I'm just sitting with it. I always think Amelia Bedelia. I'm like, ooh, that's adorable, but no, let's do stuff. We want you to be able to live your life and not just have to stare at a wall while you feel anxious. Great questions. If you have burning questions that haven't gotten answered, please feel free to shoot me an email with your questions and I will do my very best to answer it.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, we've got a lot of great comments here and people saying, I wish we had more time. I could listen to this stuff all day. Like I echo that. This is fascinating. It really is.
Love that. We
Did
do have
anyone?
another presentation coming up. It's a 4-hour free CU workshop that we offer to the community, and our next one will be May 16th. So if you want to be on the list to get that information, toss your email into the chat and we'll make sure to reach out.
Great.
That's a lot of time to spend with me though, so use your best judgment.
Well, judging by the comments today, I think you're going to get a lot of takers. Anyone have any other burning question that you needed answered before we let Kate go today? I know we're a little bit over, but I want to make sure that if anyone had any other questions, um, now's the time to ask. Otherwise, you can feel free to reach out to her. You can reach out to me as well. I'll forward any, comments or questions to her as well.
Thank you so much for having me today. This was so fun. I appreciate your questions. They were fabulous.
And thank you for your time, Kate. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. This was a very educational hour, and I appreciate your time, your talent for educating Kate. This was very informative.
So kind of you, Joseph. Thank you.
We'll see you next month, everyone.